If there is one thing that has been consistent across the over 50 years of Star Trek, it is the inconsistency of starship scaling. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today, yes, we're going to be talking about scaling again. And you will know by the title, we are going to be talking about the scaling of the Cerritos. It really says something that I think the most generally liked of all the modern Trek shows is, funnily enough, the animated comedy show. Now, by no means is Lower Decks everyone's cup of tea. However, it is clearly made from a place of love for the franchise, while others seem to either just not want to do Star Trek at all, or others are Star Trek only superficially. Lower Decks is clearly made from a place of love, and its main thing is of course poking fun at the various tropes of Star Trek. And perhaps one of the most meta jokes in Lower Decks, if it is indeed a deliberate joke, is this constantly shifting size of the Cerritos. Now, I have no way of necessarily knowing if that was deliberate, but because of what Lower Decks is, you're far more prepared to believe it. So, what I'm actually going to do today is talk about the various sizes that we could scale the Cerritos at, and basically one by one explain why they do or don't work, and we're going to try and actually come to a quote-unquote official size. Obviously, I'm not official, I'm nothing official, but a Venomverse, a Venom-approved size for the California class. So, let's get right into it. The first size that we have listed, and what you will see now if you go around the internet, is 535 meters. This is massive, this is colossal, this is huge, and this is very clearly the VFX guys at work, as usual. Now, prior to that being the widely publicised and accepted size, prior to that, we got an estimate. I don't know who originated it, but I know that Udarian on DeviantArt, when he did a orthos for the California class, he gave it a length of 339 meters. And we will be coming back to both of these sizes, but especially that one, 339 meters. So why is the bigger size so incongruous? Well, because if you look at a 535 meter Cerritos next to the Parliament class in comparison charts, it's now bigger than the Parliament. But if you go back and watch the episodes in which you have the Cerritos and the Parliament in the same shot, it's most certainly not bigger. Now, of course, the Parliament has its own bag of scaling issues. There is the size that it is presented at versus the size that would actually be indicated by the MSD in the show. And there's again at least two estimates for the size of the Parliament. I think I ran with about 600 odd meters, whereas more conservative estimates put it more in the 500 meter range. But we're not here to discuss the Parliament class. I already have a video on the Parliament, so go watch that. The reason that we get this 535 meter length for the California class, which makes it bigger than the Parliament class, is because it has a 3-deck saucer rim, and this is visible on the shooting model. However, a 3-deck saucer rim doesn't line up with the smaller size. 3-deck saucer rims, by the way, are really, really unusual. It's actually a pretty standard starship design rule. Most starships only ever have saucer rims with a 2-deck thickness. So that is, at the thinnest part of the saucer, it has a 2-deck thickness. That goes all the way back to the Constitution, and that actually goes all the way to the Galaxy class. So 3 decks on your saucer rim is very unusual. We don't tend to see that very often. And indeed, that would not line up with a smaller size. However, if you look at the MSD for the Cerritos, for the California class, we actually see a 2-deck saucer rim. Now, later fan MSDs give it 3 decks, but the actual MSDs shown in the show are 2-deck saucer rims. What this means is that effectively there's a disagreement between the windows on the exterior of the ship and the MSD. Generally speaking, I'm going to side more towards an MSD than I am windows, because windows can be very deceptively placed. I mean, I'll once again bring it up again. The Jem'Hadar attack ship. where it doesn't even have windows, but there's windows on the 3D model. I don't know why, but they're there. So it's fair to say that generally you look at MSD more than you trust Windows, because especially with different classes, a lot of trickery can be played with Windows. I mean, just look at the Inquiry class. That is not a 600-meter ship, but you make the windows small enough on it and you convince everyone that that's a 600-meter long ship. It's not. It would be silly at that length. And actually, it's worth pointing out, as I brought up when I discussed the Inquiry, that critically a more important part of starship design than the MSD or the windows is the structure of the ship. What does the structure of the ship allow? Now, this is very easy to determine in earlier periods like the 23rd century, because ships are relatively small and have very clear and easily delineated sort of deck lines and areas of structure. Whereas, of course, you move into the 24th century, everything is smooth and flush, and one deck curves into the next deck, and so on and so forth, and so that it's quite difficult to gauge scale by structure, but it can be done. So the structure of the California class is very chunky. It's a very, very, very chunky ship. Now, one of the things we have to factor in is that there is a minimum size for the turbo lifts in the warp pylons, because, you know, part of the joke of the California class is that the only way to get to engineering is to ride a turbo lift through the warp nacelle, which is a funny nod to things like the Oberth class, and it is an appropriately janky design. It's a bit silly, but it's also quite funny. I wish they made more of it, honestly. Maybe having an episode where the turbo lift breaks down in the warp nacelle, and they either have to get out, or they're like, it's slowly, like, I don't know, the radiation's driving them crazy. You could have had a more subtle reference to Enterprise and the decon chamber where there's that blue light. Put that aside, we didn't get that, whatever. But the point of that is to say that there is a minimum size that you have to have for the struts to actually allow the turbo lift to pass through. Now, there is a question as to where the saucer came from. Is this a kit bash ship? And in which case, where does this saucer come from? Now, the most obvious candidate would be the Ambassador class, with basically some additional superstructure bolted on. And you can see that. There's basically a core saucer, and then there's this different darker material layered on top of it. Now, if it was an Ambassador saucer, well, firstly, it doesn't really look like one. It's not really shaped like one. But if it were, that would give it a length of 480 meters. So we've just got our first intermediate length there, 480 meters. Now, when we look at other bits of the ship, like the warp nacelles, these are actually, as I've said before, eerily similar to the highlighter nacelles on the Cheyenne and Springfield. And it does seem to me that the California is likely from this period. It would make a lot of sense if it was from this time period. It has the right look. It has the right kind of tech level on board. It would make a lot of sense. So, okay, if we take the width of a highlighter nacelle and we scale it by that, then what you do have to accept is that the ship has extended highlighter nacelles so that they are longer than the ordinary nacelles that we see on Cheyenne and Springfield. Now, if you have the nacelles extended, you end up with 340 meters, which is very, very close to the previously stated size of 339 meters. Alternatively, if you shrink the nacelles down so that they conform to the same length as the Cheyenne and Springfield nacelles, then you end up with a length of 210 meters, and that is our smallest Cerritos, 210 meters. You could attempt to compare the engineering pod to that on the Springfield class, but it really doesn't carry much water. They're very, very different designs overall. There's not much commonality between them, so I don't think that's worth doing. So in total, we have a few sizes to look over. Of course, we have 535 meters. This will give us a Cerritos with 12 3-meter decks in the saucer. Now, this does fit the windows that we see. Then we have our 480-meter Cerritos, estimated from the Ambassador saucer comparison. That would give us 8 4-meter decks in the saucer, and that would fit the internals that we see. We do tend to see that the deck heights of the Cerritos, they are quite high, so 4-meter decks does make a bit more sense. Then, of course, we have our 339, which is 7 3-meter decks in the saucer, which is by far the most supported scale. It might not make the most sense with the show, but it does make sense with MSDs, with the structure of the ship. As I've said before, the length of nacelles, it's the best length for fitting it into the universe. And then finally we have 210 meters, which I got from my estimate of shrinking down the nacelles, and that gives us 4 3.5 meter decks. This is tiny. This is going to be very, very, very little. Really too small, I think. Apart from anything else, I think the pylons are too narrow for the turbo lift to pass through the warp nacelles. So I think ultimately that size is too small. Okay, so which of these sizes makes sense? Well, 535 meters and indeed 480 meters are massive. These are big ships. And these are far, far bigger than the role of the California really necessitates. You don't need a big California class to do the things that it's doing. It doesn't need to be a big ship. You've got to ask, what is the California class? And ultimately, it is a second-line general-purpose support ship designed to take on various missions to basically facilitate the overall operations of Starfleet. Part of that is almost certainly repair and recovery and basically serving as a giant tug. That's probably why it has this otherwise unergonomic warp sled design. It's to maximize engineering power, maximize the power of its tractor beam and its warp drive so that it can recover other ships. And when you think of that, yes, it needs to be big. Does it need to be that much bigger than what we think are probably its contemporaries in the form of, as I say, the highlighter ships? As for 210 meters, it's simply too small for a ship of the 24th century. Like I say, that's just not big enough. It would be very, very little and not that space efficient for the design that we have here. It's certainly not going to have the size and the mass to be towing. I could definitely see like a kind of ambassador class derived design with a similar sort of warp sled setup that could be that small, but I don't see the California really being that size. And it's, again, in no way does it line up with the internals that we see in the show and the scale of the ship internally. Now, if we go with 339 meters, that is kind of about right. That's the one that really is in the Goldilocks zone. While it isn't perfect internally, frankly, what is? It is very in line with the other highlighter era ships. It explains why it's still serving in the time period that we see it, because it's highlighter era technology. So it's a little bit old, which definitely lines up with how it's presented in the show, but it's also still relatively capable of doing its assigned job. So that makes a lot of sense, and it means that other ships like the Parliament class are actually impressive next to it, which again conforms to the visual evidence of the show. The Parliament class is clearly a lot bigger and more impressive than the California, which you can only really get if you come down to this kind of size bracket. Overall, I think this is the correct size, 339 meters. It best satisfies, what we need to fit in what we see of the ship, but at the same time, it also makes sense in terms of fitting it into the fleet of the 24th century. Otherwise, again, you end up with an inquiry class. So, just to round things off, I think it's worth asking, were these scale issues in Lower Decks a deliberate decision? They feel like a subtle gag by Mike McMahon, poking fun at the size inconsistencies, often between different seasons of the show. That seems like a very deliberate decision because, as I say, as the show went on, the Cerritos seemed to creep bigger and bigger and bigger until we got to the end of the show. So it does seem to kind of conform to that idea that perhaps they were doing it deliberately, or at least Mike McMahon was letting it happen. Let's point out that Mike McMahon, he knows his stuff, and from his appearance on Trek Yards, he seemed to indicate that he felt it to be quite a small ship. However, of course, as per frickin' usual, the VFX guys thought that it was a lot bigger. It's a story as old as time, isn't it? And just goes to show, just because you think it's small doesn't mean other people think it's small. So anyway, I think it's fair to say that the California class is just another example, another lesson in the long storied saga of scale inconsistencies in Star Trek, and I am sure it will not be the last. So, thank you all for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Which size do you think best makes sense for the California class? Do you agree with my thoughts that it should be 339 meters? Do you have a scale that I didn't list here? How much more life do you see the California class having after the 2380s? If it's been serving since the highlighter era, that puts it around the 2330s and 40s. How much longer has it got? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel, my glorious Navarks, Tully DT, and Midwest Safety, my ever-dutiful commanders, Philip Ty, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Kahn Strider, Sean Farrell, David Reeves, Rella, Gabe Logan, Adam Bowman, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Der Monarch, and Tin Alt. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Questo, John Nicol, Athes Collection, Tobias Klein, Bird of Play D3, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Andy Clark, Quentin King, Shipmaster, Valletta Petra Siran, Japhany Hughes, Ian Hands, Rogel Dom, Terran Emperor, Stephen Ross, and Tom Mosley. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.